Hi everybody, welcome to ACAN's first domestic retrofit event. We're going to start shortly, so just a few housekeeping points to start with. We're going to keep your microphones muted throughout, the main body of the event will be recorded, so if you're uncomfortable with being recorded, then keep your video switched off, otherwise we'll be recording from now. There is a breakout room later in the session which won't be recorded. It's just the main body of the event. So while we're waiting to start, please introduce yourselves in the chat box, let us know where you are. We've got a really interesting evening. I'll just show you the general program of events. One of our group, Barbara, is going to give us an introduction, and then we're going to have two speakers. We'll have Dominic and Marianne speaking, followed by an interactive session which we shall explain a little about when we get to it. We'll have our third speaker, Russell Smith, and then a 5-minute comfort break, which is always useful for a cup of tea or stretch your legs after a long day. We'll come back for a Q&A with the speakers, so please feel free to put questions as the event runs on in the Q&A, in the chat box I should say, and we will try to get through as many of those as possible with our speakers. We'll have a breakout session after that about the way forward for campaigning on domestic retrofit, and then you're all welcome to come to our virtual pub, the Hope in Action, for a drink afterwards and a chat, a bit more of an informal chat. So I'm going to pass you over to Barbara, who'll give you an introduction.
Hi, thank you, Sarah. Hello, everybody. We need an ambitious and well thought out approach to domestic retrofit, especially given the bigger picture that shows around 20% alone of our UK carbon dioxide emissions come from running our domestic housing stock. This approach should improve the thermal performance of our homes as well as replacing fossil fuel heating and power. To date, the government has failed to address these issues, the retrofit policy has been approached in a piecemeal style with inadequate funding and has been inconsistently implemented. The most recent example being the government U-turn abandoning the Green Homes grant. Tonight, we've invited 3 speakers from different backgrounds with a range of experience in implementing retrofit policy and in campaigning to improve home energy efficiency. I personally am looking forward to hearing their accounts and then to the discussion afterwards. Our first speaker is Dominic Millen. He describes himself as a passionate pragmatist with a background in partnership working and sustainable transport. Currently, he works for Enfield Council, and he's here to tell us about his work delivering an ambitious climate action agenda in Enfield, which includes jointly managing a London-wide housing retrofit programme for the borough. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Dominic.
Good evening, everyone. So I'll just share screen. So hopefully everyone can see that and can hear me. Good, good, some nods, I like that. Okay, I'm here to talk about the Retrofit London programme. My name's Dominic Millen. I'm currently Head of Climate Action and Sustainability at the London Borough of Enfield. And we're one of the joint lead boroughs alongside Waltham Forest for what's called the Retrofit London programme. It originates from London Council's joint statement on climate change. So basically, It identifies what we need to do for a green recovery and good growth going forward. There's 7 areas with buy-in from politicians and senior management. You'll see that obviously Retrofit London's #1, and then there's various other areas covered. We have to say that it's not in order of priority, but that's just so that resilient and green at #7 don't feel too bad. But we all know retrofit is most important. So in terms of what we're looking at, currently it's the retrofit of all domestic buildings to an average of EPC-B by 2030. It's a challenging but necessary ambition. I think it's a really good point about the percentage of carbon emissions coming from domestic use. In Enfield, for example, it's actually 38% of our borough-wide. So it's a huge challenge for us. As I mentioned, we've got joint lead boroughs. It's a big programme, and so we decided with colleagues at Waltham Forest that we would kind of split it between us. What we're doing is developing a retrofit action plan. We're engaging with other boroughs and other organisations, I should hasten to add. And then once we've developed that, we'll coordinate and monitor delivery. And that includes providing updates up to what's called London Council's Transport and Environment Committee. Basically, that's councillors, lead councillors from each of the boroughs. So it's quite a senior set of people in the local government world. As I said, we're #1 for a reason. There's a potentially huge positive impact across a range of areas: carbon emissions, skills, and addressing potentially fuel poverty. Just in case you're wondering how we align with the Greater London Authority, this fits with their Green New Deal. They're actually looking at private sector in particular as one of their key elements, and so we're slotting in alongside that. And as I mentioned, it's domestic at the moment, but we're going to follow up with non-domestic once we've got this bit of the work out of the way. So excuse me. So programme progress to date. This really comes from the London Housing Directors Group, and they identified, I think it's about 18 months ago, a need for action in this area. There's a home retrofit task and finish group, which has been providing input into our action plan development, and that's involved 25 of the 33 London local authorities to date. It's also got the Greater London Authority, and we've been talking to other providers, housing providers. We've completed research by a company called Communityled Projects. That looks into the measures, costs and skills needed to deliver the retrofit at scale that's been identified. And again, that was funded by a variety of groups, so the Greater London Authority, London Housing Directors, London Councils, and the London Environment Directors Network. And so that's just to demonstrate that it's actually, it meshes across a number of areas. We're developing a position on integrating carbon and fuel poverty. So thinking wider than just EPC-B, looking at carbon reduction, but also one of the key things, particularly for local authorities, is addressing fuel poverty and looking at how we can benefit low-income households. As I mentioned, extensive engagement to date, including retrofitting and green finance experts. So obviously they're key to determining, one, what we're going to do about skills, and two, how we're going to pay for it. We've got a draft London Housing Retrofit Action Plan. It's been developed by a grouping of consultants led by Etude, and I think Thomas from Etude's on the call today, so he can tell me if I get any of this wrong. And that's going to be finalised, we're hoping, by mid-July. So I think this is just a useful infographic because that was a lot of words, and it just shows how it's currently fitting together. So we've got the data analysis, one of the building blocks. What we've done recently is we've developed some key principles, because there are so many actions within the action plan that what we realised is potentially there's different pathways to follow. So by agreeing key principles, we think that basically everyone can sign up and everyone can be involved. As I've said, they will feed into the action plan that's pretty well developed now. And then the next stage will be for the lead boroughs to develop an implementation plan. So looking probably at about a 2 to 3 year delivery horizon. So progress to date, this is the data analysis. It's based on Communityled Projects Pathways database. It effectively collects a lot of data, really based mainly on open EPC. And then what they do is they take all of it, and where there's not an EPC, for example, they clone and similar property. So what it does is it actually now covers every single property in London. So there's kind of the graphic there about where are we now. So London wide, as you'll see, huge number of homes, 3.8 million. Interestingly, a lot of homes in conservation areas. London's got the most conservation areas in the country. What I find quite interesting is the build date, average build date, 1930 to 1949, but that covers a huge range. The predominant property type is flats. One of the biggest challenges is the main wall type is solid brick. So it takes out the opportunity for relatively cost-effective cavity wall insulation. And unsurprisingly, our heating systems are predominantly mains gas. And you'll see there over on the left, the SAP rating, average SAP rating is 63. So what does all that tell us? Basically, what we've looked at is 2 pathways to get into EPCB. We've called them interim and net zero. You'll see that under the interim scenario, you retrofit about 3.4 million properties. And what it actually looks at is it assumes that you'll do your focus on fabric for a relatively high percentage of properties. You'll do some replacement of gas with heat pumps and other alternatives. And what that does is it gets you to that average EPCB. What it doesn't really do is it doesn't significantly reduce the CO2 emissions coming from your properties. And that's one of the weaknesses of using EPC as a metric, is because it's a value indicator. So the estimate for funding the interim is £49 billion, which is a pretty big number. Its average investment per property of 13,000. You've got to be slightly careful though, because that ranges from, you know, a few £100, because some properties need very little to get them up to the hurdle, to £100,000 for others. So that does mask quite a range. And in effect, what that does is that achieves our target. But what we've also done is looked at net zero, because that's the Mayor of London's target. And what you see there is virtually every property needs some kind of retrofit measure, and it doubles in price because you have to do a lot more properties and you have to do a lot more to them. Your average investment almost doubles as well, but you do get improved SAP. And if you look down there at the bottom, the average improvement in terms of CO2 emissions is much greater. What we've also done, or should I say what Parity have also done, is they looked at what this means in terms of developing retrofit skills. So they undertook some trades analysis. You'll see in the interim scenario, it goes from around 4,000 jobs now to needing nearly 110, well, over 110,000 by 2030. that's a huge skills gap. Interestingly, if you look along the bottom, you'll see that the first sector and the second largest requirement is actually general builders. So it's not even retrofit specialists. We need another 50,000 general builders to deliver this program. You need 66,000 insulation specialists. That's a huge challenge. It's also a huge opportunity. You know, this should be driving our economy. In terms of net zero, as it was for investment, it's almost double the number of jobs required. So what does the action plan look at? Key focus areas, retrofitting measures, packages and plans, delivery models, skills and supply chain, cost funding and finance, engagement and take up. And then something we're also looking at, and we had a workshop on earlier in the week, is archetypes. So trying to see if we can identify, and it comes back to the pathways concept, some relatively simple to understand approaches. It's very difficult because obviously there is a lot of housing in London. It's very diverse. And so you could end up with thousands of archetypes. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to come up with something that hits the most important and the largest areas in terms of stock. And then the approach is to have those principles I was talking about, the pathways I've just mentioned, and then beneath that are the actions with what we're calling interventions, and that's very much getting into the nitty-gritty. So the things that we need to implement quickly, and the things that are the building blocks that will help us deliver the plan. So these are the principles. I haven't got time to go through them in detail. I think it's probably worth bearing in mind that they kind of fit under, I would say, sort of 2 or 3 areas. One is really the role that boroughs can play, and that's things like boroughs working collectively to support the development of skills and delivery models, retrofitting their own stock, and then trying to make the planning process more streamlined for retrofit measures. And then there's some things around what we actually do and what we need to encourage other people to do. So, for example, moving away from gas heating rapidly. You'll notice there that we've taken a view that hydrogen is unlikely to be the answer in the life of this plan. And then there's one there that we think is particularly important, and that's that we want to avoid a significant increase in energy costs for householders. So one of the things that we've picked up is that retrofit won't necessarily reduce your reduce your bills. And that's because if you use at the moment some kind of heat pump, electricity is a premium compared to gas. So you could end up paying slightly more, which is then offset by fabric improvements or by solar PV. So we're just mindful that we don't want to make too many promises around potentially saving people thousands of pounds. So what are the next steps? I mentioned we need to write an implementation plan. That covers deliverables, milestones, governance and structures. I mentioned briefly there is already existing governance around the wider London Council's kind of London programme. We need to work out what the delivery mechanisms will be. We're clear that boroughs will play their role, but it is not boroughs alone. This needs both central government and private sector to step up. Monitoring arrangements, including measures, how we're actually going to work out if we're achieving anything. Resourcing, always a favourite, what my directors keep asking me about. And then engagement and comms. And I think one of the things that is really interesting is if you say to someone, is climate change important? I think there was some research and it's about 80% of Londoners said, yeah, it's a top priority. We've got to get on with climate change. And then when you ask them who's going to do it, it's never them. So I think it's selling this, and retrofit is actually quite a hard sell. Someone put it to us a few weeks ago that people have spent £16,000 on a new kitchen. They don't feel the same way about a heat pump. So, you know, how do you sell those benefits? How do you sell something that frankly people don't really see as an enhancement? And then, you know, finally on this, we're looking to publicly launch the action plan and the programme at London pre-COP26 conference. And supporting that, we will be developing our asks. What do we think we need? And that was it from me. I don't know if there are any immediate questions. There's contact details there. It's my colleague, James at Waltham Forest, myself, and then our two colleagues from London Councils who've been lending us really good support to bring this programme forward. Shall I stop sharing?
Yeah, that would be brilliant. Thank you, Dominic. Perfect timekeeping too.
Thank you very much, Dominic. That was very interesting and informative. Our second speaker is Marianne Heaslip, who has come here tonight, having had various things happening today. Marianne is an architect and associate principal of Urbed. She has particular expertise in retrofit, being involved in policy and the development of tools to support better retrofit. This expertise has informed the development of the people-powered retrofit service for homeowners in collaboration with Carbon Co-op in Manchester. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Marianne.
Thank you very much, Barbara. And yeah, thank you for inviting me tonight. I can see from all the stuff in the chat, there's an interesting group of people here, so hopefully we'll have a good discussion later. I will just share my screen. I've got two ways of doing this, and let's see which one actually works. So are you able to see that? Is that working? Yeah. Okay. And the slide just changed. So yeah, that's me. Sarah asked me to say a little bit about myself and how I got into retrofit, because I've been involved in it now for over a decade. So I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about that, because I know there are probably people on the call who are interested and potentially want to get into it more as other architects. So this is a picture of the terrace that's adjacent to Home Baked Bakery in Anfield, which some of you might have heard of, which is community business, and they've got an associated community land trust. And in 2008, 2009, I just qualified as an architect with impeccable timing, because it was when the crash hit. I was working at Paul Thomas Edwards' office in Liverpool. I'd always been interested in participative design. I'd always been interested in kind of environmental approaches to design. And I got asked to get involved in some engagement work related to what became Home Baked at the time. It was an arts project called 2 Up, 2 Down. And I think this, for those of you who know the history, this is in the housing, one of the areas that was affected by housing market renewal. And it seemed like an absolute insanity that we were demolishing hundreds and hundreds of what could be perfectly decent terrace houses to build kind of fairly not that brilliant new build spec housing at much lower densities. There were just lots of things about it that didn't make sense. As it happened, I kind of took the opportunity, because I could see the writing on the wall. PTE later shut their Liverpool office. I went off and signed up for a master's degree at CAT, did the MSc there, and alongside that, I got invited back to, because I'd previously worked at Urbed on a year out, and they just got involved in one of the TSB Retrofit for the Future projects. So I went back and worked on that part-time while I was doing my MSc. So that's kind of how I got involved. It was partly what was going on in the wider world, partly just realizing we have all these houses that are going to need something done to them, and wanting to learn about what we might be able to do to tackle them. So since 2010, I just kind of sat and thought about all the different stuff that I've been involved in, and it's always been both as an architect, as a designer, actually delivering schemes, but sometimes also helping to instigate and develop them. So the work with Carbon Corp in Manchester, which some of you might be aware of, they're a cooperative of householders who want to do stuff to their own homes, and kind of developing projects, developing tools and services, developing training with them. And alongside that, doing policy work as well. So we wrote a report ages ago called the Community Green Deal, before the Green Deal became a dirty word, for the Social Housing Action Partnership in the West Midlands. And whilst I think a lot of the things that we said in there about what needed to be done to instigate retrofit and to scale it up, so a lot of it still holds. Some of it has probably changed a bit, but the idea of starting with early adopters, kind of taking a decimation principle, building up the skills and tools, I think that all still kind of stands. Alongside all of that, I've always done a bit of work with housing associations, particularly in the Northwest, looking at what they can do to skill up and also to deliver retrofit, and then working with organisations like Homebaked. So I've always had, they're just up the road from where I live, so I've always had some kind of engagement with Homebaked, but since 2018 we've been working on a particular retrofit project, which I will mention a bit more in a minute. In doing all of this work, and I'm sure a lot of this will be covered, I know Letty, you're in the middle of developing a retrofit guide, and there'll be loads of stuff that comes out that relates to these principles, but this is kind of what I've learned over the last decade. What are the things that are important to consider? Really, really key when people talk about whole house, I think it's good to understand that we're not necessarily saying you have to make improvements, rip the house to bits, strip it back and do everything all at once. That's just not possible for everyone, budget-wise, or what levels of disruption they can live with. But it is really important to understand that our homes are a kind of series of interacting systems, and a lot of the problems that have been seen in the past are when that hasn't been done and people have just stuck something on a wall and assumed that it'll be fine, but not realised that that can have unintended consequences. And I suppose a step on from that is that we like to think about homes not just as individual kind of energy islands, they're part of the wider energy system. So when you're doing your calculations and your modelling, you should be considering the impact on the wider system, not just kind of looking at your house in complete isolation, because most homes in the UK, not all, but most are linked in to the national grid or into the gas grid or whatever. We talk a lot about fabric first. Mostly when people talk about that, they're thinking about things like insulation and airtightness, and that is a lot of what it's about. And that's important because we know it kind of works. If you put some insulation on the wall and you do it right, you can kind of work out what it's going to do, and it's probably not going to go anywhere. It'll carry on doing that thing for a while. But it also needs to include consideration of ventilation and, really crucially, maintenance. Quite often we get people approaching us saying that they want to retrofit their houses, but they've got a load of broken gutters and they haven't done any of their repointing for years. So you need to, those things are important too. You can't think of just the energy stuff outside of the kind of where the building is as a whole and its condition. We talk about science-based targets, so that's about getting from where we are now to where we need to be, rather than just kind of what we can do slightly incrementally to make things less bad. So I think things like space heating demand or peak load, or things that are measurable, are really useful. and they don't change their physical property of the building itself. So they don't change over time. I think, as has already been mentioned, SAP and EPC ratings can be a bit problematic because they're built up from a number of other different assumptions that do change over time. So things like the cost of energy, or the cost of or the carbon intensity of the fuel grid, of the electricity grid. So they're important, but as a designer, you kind of want to know what's going to make the building better, and what happens to the energy system over time is a consideration, but it's kind of outside what you're deciding to do with that particular window or wall. Especially over the last few years, but more and more even over the last 18 months, we've been a bit more aggressive in talking about ditching carbon and fossil fueled heating systems. So, and it's really popular. Loads of people, I know there was a comment about people don't see a heat pump and wouldn't spend money on it in the same ways they would a kitchen. I probably hang out with some quite weird people, because I do know people who are really excited and do want to spend 16 grand on a heat pump. They're all the early adopters. They're all the people who care about this stuff already. And part of what we've been doing is trying to help them overcome the barriers they face, which will then hopefully develop the system. And then people who don't care as much, maybe they'll come along later. We always think about embodied impacts, though actually doing retrofit already, you're dealing with a lot of those. And we always think about the performance gap. So that's between the assumptions and the designs and how buildable they are, design stage, and what happens in reality. So we always try and do monitoring and evaluation and learn from that. I think that's something that the construction industry as a whole could really get better at. So we've taken these principles and we are applying them in a few different projects, which I'll just touch on briefly now, but I think it's, yeah, I can provide a load of links afterwards. So the first one is People-Powered Retrofit, which is a collaboration with Carbon Corp. And this is aimed purely at kind of early adopter owner-occupier householders who maybe have a bit of money, want to spend it on doing up their house. So they're already interested, they're already engaged, helping them overcome the barriers they face, which are largely not about money, but about knowing what to do and making sure that a job gets done well, and finding those people to do the job in the first place, because there are some significant supply chain constraints, which are being made worse at the moment with the situation in the industry as a whole. And we're kind of taking a twin track approach. So we think we're working with householders to help them make their decisions, whilst also working with contractors to help them skill up, and then matchmaking the two. Always with that diagram is kind of a bit of an illustration of, like, people talk about retrofit sometimes as if it's like buying a car, and it's really not. It's very much, it's incredibly complicated. There's a lot of interacting things. You've got planning, you've got building control, you've got various British standards and accreditations. A householder will, as a rule, not know about any of those things, and it might be the only building project they ever do, so why would they want to learn about them all? We need to kind of make something that is quite complicated into something that's quite simple. So that's what we're trying to do with People-Powered Retrofit. I'm also working on a couple of the social housing decarbonisation fund projects, and with some, well, some of the housing associations who are getting involved potentially in that. For those of you who don't know, these are kind of demonstrator projects to look at how you do whole house retrofit at scale. And the timescales for them, quite frankly, are insane. They awarded the contracts to the local authorities or housing associations just around about Christmas time, didn't sign the paperwork till a bit later, and they're meant to be finished by Christmas or not long after, so not ideal. This kind of work I really do enjoy. It's generally not very glamorous. It has the potential to make a huge difference to people's lives, because the block that you can see there, that's some 1970s wimpy no finds that currently have a space heating demand of something around 200 kilowatt hours per square metre per annum, which for those of you who know those kind of figures, that's about 50% more, getting on for 50% more than the UK national average. So they're really, really badly insulated and really quite expensive and unpleasant to live in. There's an ambitious target of 50 kilowatt hours, so we're basically reducing the heat demand in those by 70–75%. I know that might not sound ambitious to some of the people who get involved in Passive House, but given the budgets we've got, and also given that these are quite small flats, so when you've got a kind of against a metre square rating like that, it kind of discriminates a little bit against small houses, and these flats are just about 50 square metres, so it's challenging. We're using past 2035, taking a risk assessed and holistic approach and thinking about lots of things, including radon, which actually isn't in past 2035, but I believe will be in the next iteration. I suppose the main interesting thing for me from this, for the discussion maybe later, is that a lot of the barriers in this aren't really technical. Like you can see from the picture of that flat block, kind of putting some insulation on the walls, re-roofing, putting new doors and windows in, that is, there's some complexity to it, but it's relatively simple. The issues that we have on this stuff tends to be with things around party walls and highways and all of the things that complicate any other architectural project. And the things that are challenging are the things that are challenging to good design on any architecture project. So it's about timescales, it's about understanding the brief, making sure that everyone's kind of knows what we're doing and why. And then finally, I'll mention home-baked CLT, but there are a couple of other kind of more community-led projects we're involved in as well. What I really like about these, so this is the bakery at the end of the block, nearest, that is Liverpool Football Club's ground at the end there. Working with the CLT to refurbish the entire block of 9 terraces, and it will include houses, so it's actually been reconfigured to provide some flats, some houses, but also some community business space as well, and thinking about its relationship with the green space next to it. What I really enjoy about these projects is that it's about much, much more than just insulation. It's about kind of taking something that people really cared about in an area where a lot of the houses have been demolished. People are adamant that that brick facade had to be maintained because that was kind of one of the few left in the neighbourhood that was how the area had been previously. But then they were quite happy to be quite radical around the back. So we've got external wall insulation around the back, but it kind of works all together as a system. So it's quite pleasing that we've got the energy and the kind of local economic development and some of the kind of other community engagement and development and even food systems all integrated with that. There's loads of stuff written about that project. We're currently, we've had a few COVID delays, related delays, but we're currently working through that and hoping to be on site later in the year. So I'll just finish with, from my own experience of all of this over the last decade, some kind of policy and campaign asks. And those of you who've been around Retrofit a while have probably heard, especially that first one before, a stable policy environment with an idea of what's happening. You all know how long it takes to develop any kind of building project. If you're told something like the Green Homes Grant is happening and then all of a sudden it's not happening and then something else is happening, it makes it almost impossible to plan. The way that we've ended up doing it, and actually one of the reasons why people-powered retrofit has been developed, is we started doing that work kind of outside of policy and funding environments because we knew what we wanted to do. What some funding has then enabled us to do is to do that work a bit quicker, but we're kind of following our own path with it. Planning reform would be really helpful. It would be nice if we didn't get held up in planning for every time we wanted to put some external wall insulation on, though I really appreciate that there have been some absolutely horrific looking external wall insulation jobs done. Procurement reform, and that's like the whole shebang. And again, this is nothing that doesn't happen on other projects, but it's about getting the right people with the right skills, having a program that allows you to do proper assessment and design, proper QA on site, evaluation and monitoring afterwards. Supply chain and skills development, I'm really not quite sure where, when we've got so there was a Green Homes grant, there is still the local authority part of the Green Homes grant. There's a social housing decarbonisation fund. There's a couple of other things happening with the public buildings decarbonisation fund. All of this has launched kind of all of a sudden after basically 5 years of a complete desert, after the failure of the Green Deal in kind of 2014, 15, around then. I'm not sure where the funders thought all the people to do this work were going to come from, because they don't just, sprout up out of the ground overnight. This is skilled work, and people need time to develop an apprentice and learn it. And then VAT reform, which I know there have been a couple of parliamentary petitions on that one, and if you should sign whichever is the one that's active at the moment, because just to level the playing field between new build and retrofit, it's one of the things, especially probably on some of the housing association and community-led projects, that makes it really difficult, because a project that would stack up if the VAT wasn't at 20%, as soon as you apply that 20% VAT, all of a sudden doesn't, and it's really unhelpful. But I will end there and stop sharing my screen. So thank you. Hope that made some kind of sense.
Thank you so much. That was really great, and such a breadth of work that you're involved in. I mean, your finishing slide is actually really timely, because it's where we're going to take the conversation now. We're going to ask everybody here to share what they feel the priorities for campaigning for retrofit, for those changes that you talked about, from VAT reform and from upskilling and all of those things. So basically, I'm going to share a link in the Zoom chat. That should give you a link to Mentimeter. So I'm trying to do some technical things at the same time as speak, and my skills are shoddy at best. So here is my screen share for the Mentimeter. So I hope you can all see that. It should form a word cloud. Let's see. There we go. Right. So I see people are already inputting. So hopefully you've all seen the link, and that you can start to put in just a couple of words about what you feel the priorities are. And then we shall see. Should be quite interesting to see where people's priorities sit. What we'll do with all of this is take the conversation further in the breakout sessions after our next speaker, but it will be interesting to see what the priorities are. And already there's a lot of push for VAT reform. So we'll give this a couple of minutes, because thankfully we've got a really great turnout tonight. And a massive thank you to everybody for coming, because it's been difficult to be indoors on Zoom when we've got such beautiful weather finally outdoors for a lot of the country. So it's going to be really interesting to see what 105 of you think. It's still very much about VAT and upskilling, education. This is really fascinating. I imagine there's probably quite a little bit of overlap as well in some of the ones that aren't quite as big on the screen, about upskilling the industry and skilled labour. I can see quite a few of those. It's interesting about architectural waste and popular buy-in as well. I think there's a lot to be said for the engagement with the wider public, and not just us in our little architecture silos sometimes.
Sarah, can I just say something about upskilling? So one of the things I meant to say and didn't was, so I've obviously spent a lot of time over the last few years upskilling myself and learning how to use things like PHPP, and doing loads of understanding therm and doing thermal bridge modelling and design modelling. I've actually found that incredibly satisfying as an approach to design, because you're able to then integrate it with your own design work and make all of those kind of meaningful, very meaningful design decisions. And I think it's something that as a profession, there's real value in it for us potentially.
Yeah, that's a really important point to remember, that we also have a responsibility to upskill. And I think there's a lot of debate going on about architects and other design professionals, you know, being both building physics literate as well as carbon and climate literate. So I think that's a really, really good point. This is really fascinating. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop showing my screen, but this will be shared again. This image will be shared again. And so everybody can see where those things are. But we will take the biggest priority items from this word cloud, and they will form themed breakout rooms for our second session, or for the second interactive session, where we can continue the conversation. Groups I imagine to be about 10 people in each group, and there'll be a facilitator in each one, and we'll just sort of have a brainstorming session using a Miro board to continue the conversation. And we welcome everybody here to join either the existing buildings group in ACAN to continue to push that conversation, or to join ACAN wider, just get involved in the network and see if you feel that you have some energy to add to some of these campaigns. That would be great. So whilst that's still running, I'm just going to do a time check, see where we are. Well, I'm going to hand the mic over to Russell Smith. As I've mentioned, Russell well, you can tell us about yourself, Russell, but Russell has started Parity Projects, I think about 15 years ago. Is that right, Russell? And you're involved in lots of things, as well as writing what was an excellent report from his involvement with writing the Construction Leadership National Retrofit strategy report, which I think everybody would highly recommend having a read of that. So I will pass over to you.
Thank you. Okay, can you just let me know when you can see my screen? Yeah, great. Okay, thanks for having me, everybody. Okay, if you want to hear about me. I'm Russell Smith. I'm a civil engineer. I started Parity Projects, crikey, it's actually nearly 17 years ago now, after retrofitting my own house and having a horrible time. So for me, it was something that was born out of necessity, really. I really thought it'd be quite straightforward, and I couldn't find anybody that could give me any advice. Nobody knew what they were doing, full stop. So I started, I guess I lived in the house for about a year to work out the best things to do. Developed a bit of software that helped me work out the best things, because I'm a bit weird like that. It started work and invited lots of people to come and have a look. And after 3 years and 3,000 visitors, I realized that there's probably a business in it. So I often worry that people think there isn't a market. People are genuinely interested. They just never made an offer that's very attractive. And I would, if you wanted to take one thing away from what I'm about to talk about, is that make people a decent offer, and you know what? They'll want it. And we've failed to do that in the retrofit market ever. Doesn't matter what sector you think you're talking about. It's fuel poverty, because you can't even give the stuff away, right? Whether you're talking about people that want to go high end, I agree with some of the comments earlier on. They'd rather buy bling. You've got to make them a decent offer. It's got to be compelling. And hopefully, the work that I've done with colleagues at the Construction Leadership Council's RMI working group is try to crystallise what that might mean for the UK. I've come at this from the perspective of somebody now. We model for Parity Projects. We model the opportunities for getting to zero carbon for large stocks of houses. So, for instance, we've just worked for London councils, and we modelled every individual address in London, and we built a database, and we've run net zero scenarios across the entire city to work out what would be the least cost way. And there are obviously a number of ways of doing it to get to net zero. We've done that for Greater Manchester, we're about to do it for the entire Northwest. So, but once you get that level of granularity, you can start to really understand the issues. And we use some of that data to work up towards a national model so that we can have an idea of what it would mean to get every house in the UK retrofitted toward net zero. And on that basis, we worked with a number of people led by the Federation of Master Builders to get our heads around what it would really take to get the market moving. How would we get a number of different offers, because there are a number of different types of people that buy in a lot of different ways, that live in very different houses from each other. How do we get an offer to all of those people to do something at last? And I'm going to go through, I'll invite you to go onto the Construction Leadership Council website and find the latest version of the report. It's version 2 that's out now. Still consultation, it's not cast in stone. This is a document that's trying to get government to do something right at last. And it's been delivered in consultation with a very wide range of organisations that I'll show you later. And I'm going to give you several, probably about 6 slides of the headlines. Of course, 27 million homes or thereof need to be got to net zero if we're going to have any chance of meeting our net zero requirements of the country. 2050 feels too far away if you're going to try and have any impact at all on minimising the man-made climate change. So we've done our modelling based on the 2040 target. But let's not beat around the bush. The government is absolutely holding the key to some things that nobody else can unlock, and they have to play their part. However, what's come out of our consultation is that industry is very well placed and willing to spend a hell of a lot of money to make it work, investing in themselves. And government only needs to provide a proportion of the money that's needed. So this isn't about money, actually. This is about leadership. So at the heart of this, though, is a training development program that will need to provide 400,000 skilled tradespeople into the industry to work across the UK. And I'll show you that modelling later. It needs to impact every part of the UK, driving local economies everywhere. And it needs to be something on that basis. It doesn't seem to be done to people. If what you're doing is creating a movement of people that are trained and employed locally, they're working on their own houses, it's their project. And on that basis, we're proposing a central agency. And this is a bit of a Marmite subject, I'll be honest, akin to what we've described as the Olympic Delivery Authority, in the way that it organised, led and inspired people to do this. And not just the athletes, let's call them the contractors in this situation, or the architects. But actually, you remember the volunteers that went out there and really made it happen? I call those, with my Retrofit Works hat on, advocates, organisations, people, volunteers that will talk about this and encourage others. Bringing them into the fold will accelerate change. Breaking down some of the numbers, if this was got off the ground in a proper fashion, we believe that jobs can be created directly and indirectly in around about 120,000 people in year 1 alone, and ramping that up to the 520,000 by year 5. Obviously, there'll be new people within the industry, but those are additional people that will service all those 400,000 people that are doing the skilled stuff as well. CO2 savings of 21% by 2019, back towards 2030. That's coinciding with the EPCC target by 2030, but perhaps we'll talk about what that really means in the discussion later on. And then CO2 savings of 90% by 2040. So there's still work to do, even though we do as much as we can on retrofit. Going back to Marianne's example of that block of social housing later, some things you just can't do because it's too expensive. So you have to find other ways to get the carbon out of the system. But one of the key ingredients of this is what we've called interlocking components. Key facets of an overall strategy that mean if you take any one of them away, all of them will fail. And this is the thing that keeps getting missed by government. You have to have a very holistic model where things are dealt with very properly and in a very considered fashion. But yet, when we've consulted on this with people in government, actually, the initial reaction tends to be, okay, yeah, sure, that's great. But if you could do 1 or 2 of these, which ones would you do? And we say, I won't tell you what I say in my mind, but ultimately, it's got to be done as a whole. You look at all of the examples of retrofit that have been attempted at national scale over the last 20 years, and they've all been dreadful because they haven't done all of these things, right? So I've talked about the leadership. One really lovely one, which Gavin Killett from Oxford University put in bottom left there, was effectively a safe space for development and transition. We've got a very, what's the best way to describe this? We've got an industry that is very good at writing contracts and telling people they've done bad things and not paying them, all right? That's not a safe space for innovating and trying new things. How can we create a safe space that enables people to try things? Builders that have been in the industry for 35 years trying a new type of insulation, and at the moment, the only way for them trying that new type of insulation is going on a training course and charging you 3 times what he thinks it really costs because he doesn't want to make a loss. That doesn't foster change. Performance standards. The bottom line of this is ultimately making an offer to a householder and ensuring, guaranteeing that it performs as you've promised. And that's not just on energy, that's just not just on water, but that's on air quality as well. All of those things combined and making sure the house performs really as it ought to. So that's changing the offer. At the moment, it's kind of, here's your design, here's my contract, let's all hope for the best. We can't work on that basis. So there's a commercial element to performance standards as well, not just the building regs. Finance and grants, well, we all know about this stuff. People tend to home in on this, is that we need innovative finance. There's loads of money. We need a good offer. People will spend the money if you can give them a good offer. Training and accreditation, I think that goes without saying that we need, you know, a mighty upskilling. But our view is that the current training mechanisms within local colleges, there's not only they're teaching the wrong stuff, but they're teaching it in the wrong way. So that does need root and branch reform. I am sitting on the government's Green Jobs Task Force right now, and there's some really interesting thinking going into this. Materials and equipment. This wasn't a starter. This was something that we felt, you know, that we needed to bring the suppliers and the distributors and manufacturers within the supply chain into this. And we couldn't be talking about this at a more depressingly opportune moment, to be fair, with virtually nothing being available right now in builders merchants. You know, if we'd have known about this problem, if we'd worked together to know this was happening, we could be doing more design and facilitation and getting ready for projects, pushing them out, or whatever it might be. But at the same time, you'll see some of the numbers shortly. These people need to know what to invest in terms of the modelling that we've done to predict what measures will be needed. Creating customer demand. I honestly think with some of the projects that we've been dealing with over the last 3 years, alongside Marianne, we've had some funding from Bays to roll out some able to pay retrofit projects. We have no shortage of customers. Our problem is getting the industry to meet the demand in the right way within a good offer. Compliance and quality regime, making sure that things get done well. At the moment, competent person schemes are abound. And for those of you who are not quite sure what that means, it's the example will be, say, the gas safe model, and I'm not holding this out as a bad example, it's just this is the model. Gas safe engineer designs the installation, installs the installation, signs off their own work, and a percentage of their jobs will be audited. Okay, we can't be relying on this. If we're trying to build up the trust between our industry and householders, we need virtually everything to be comprehensively reviewed. That needs proper investment in a compliance and quality regime. The philosophy behind the build-up of the pace was to go slow at the start, speed up, race through the 2030s, and deliberately slow down towards the end, because what we want to promise people is a long-term career underpinned by government leadership and good policies, but then for them to go somewhere else when that has finished, and to them to be gradually trained on other things as the retrofit gets done. It's never going to be an S-curve, is it? But you know, that's the theory. We want to tell the right story, but building up slowly. That's the opposite of the Green Deal, and all the policies Marianne had just read out. They all started at once. Go on, industry, go and deliver that lot. Well, they're not there. So it's about trying to make sure things are done systematically and deliberately. And there are the curves there that just play out where the idealised reduction in carbon will come from. But there will be some left. So we have to think about offsetting. I saw one of the comments in the chat earlier on. Well, how do you define net zero? I don't know. We have to work that out together as an industry. But what I will tell you is, there isn't enough money to do the buildings to the extent that we'll get them literally zero within the building itself. There has to be some kind of offsetting of the carbon elsewhere. The numbers of measures, huge numbers of installations of measures on a per annum basis over this period. So when you take an S-curve, you look at it on a per annum basis in terms of installs, we're looking at a bell curve now. So, you know, heat pumps, so we've taken it on a basis that there'll be no gas boilers going in again. But when you see the trades coming up later on, you'll see that actually we'd still need to be training gas engineers, because there's gas involved in taking out the boiler, right? And the average age of a gas engineer in the UK is 56. We've got a problem there now, but even before we start a ramp up of a retrofit program. But a heat pump ready house needs work. You need to be getting the heat losses down to a given level before an acceptably low cost size heat pump will actually do a good job for you. You can't just chuck a heat pump at a building. Moreover, you can't install a heat pump into every building in the country overnight. Look forward to a zero carbon electricity grid because the grid can't cope with that level of load. So there's lots of balances to be had in the middle of all of this. Trades. On the far left, this is 1997. You can see the number of tradespeople that have been working in the RMI sector over the years. 2008, big drop off, and we still haven't recovered in the sector from 2008. I don't have any recent figures that have seen everybody disappearing back over to Europe after Brexit, but what we have got here is the modelling of what we need, and it's huge. And there are regular trades here, and we don't need any fancy new trades, but what we do need, and I think we can get, we can be asking for less people working in industry if we work together better. We've got better ways of surveying, modelling, projecting forward, planning for when work gets to happen. Information flows so that there isn't any rework, taking things out that were put in 5 years before, in an ill thought out manner, so we don't have to do the next thing easy. All those kind of things will reduce the numbers and hopefully speed things up for us. And here's the money. Year one, we've asked for actually slightly less money than this. Sorry, by year four, the parliamentary period, I beg your pardon here. 5.3 billion government invest. We've actually, that's less than the Conservative Party promised in their manifesto for this parliament period, because we're suggesting you go slowly, invest in the good stuff, underpinning the market, building up the supply chain. But that will need long-term policy commitments, because people don't want to go and do a load of training for it to be pulled away as soon as they're qualified. So this needs long-term messaging. And the work that's been done with Leeds University here has shown that for the returns that come back from it, this is investable in terms of revenue that comes back through VAT receipts. We have modelled 0% VAT on some scenarios. The feedback from government on our consultation with them is, good luck. I honestly, I don't think that's something that's going to happen unless we really get together in an industry and say we can make that work and show them the benefits of the VAT reduction, because they can't see those just yet. I'm not sure that will happen, but there are other triggers as well. The health benefits alone are absolutely enormous. You roll these all up together. This is a great business case for UK PLC. There is a return investment even after the first year. So importantly, in the first year, it's looking to spend this kind of work, this kind of money on getting that going in the first year. So that variable stamp duty, for instance, we believe that is a revenue neutral opportunity. This national retrofit body, innovation in the supply chain, skills and training, local authority-based programs, doing this from the ground up, working from a regional basis, not being told what to do by this national retrofit body. The body is there to try and facilitate change. It's not telling people how to do it. It's asking, it's learning, it's sharing ideas. And property passports, and making sure that each building has an accessible way of seeing what happened before, and what therefore is being projected forward. So you work with the plan, and people can access that when they buy a property. They know that they've got an agenda to follow. So multiple benefits, every community benefits. Not limited to a single sector. Obviously, in the manufacturing, labour market, etc. Across the entire country could benefit from this. And I'll just be repeating things I've already said here by going through this slide. These are all the people that have supported it so far. I think even this is slightly out of date now. We've got bigger, lots of logos coming in every time we present this. And I'd invite you, if you want to get involved with this, here's the link. And I'm very happy for these slides to be shared with everyone, by the way. And if you've got any suggestions or want to put any support, any comments, email FMB, they're accumulating those. But I wanted to do first, just for 1 more minute, if it's okay, just give an example of what we've been doing with our 3 able to pay supply chain pilots, but funded by BASE, to show really how this could be facilitated. And this is where some of the inspiration came from within the report. So Cozy Homes Oxfordshire is one of our schemes. And the drive for this is behind it is Retrofit Works, working in collaboration. Retrofit Works is a not-for-profit cooperative. It's owned by 2 kinds of member. Advocates, these are the ones I mentioned earlier on, people that represent a constituency of people who want to get this done. That could be a local transition town. In our case, in Oxfordshire, low carbon hub, and we work with National Energy Foundation as well to get this off the ground. In other parts of the country, there can be different types of organisation. But ultimately, this is a collaboration between two groups of organisations. Behind it all, as I mentioned earlier on, there's this database of individual dwellings, and that enables us to do two things. Strategically, we can identify properties that would be able to do certain types of retrofit with a certain budget, so we can go to them with an offer without just blanket marketing everybody. So we can say to certain parts of a local authority area, for instance, this is what we can do for you. Is this of interest? And when we start, as the ball rolls more and more, we'll start to understand how people react to that. And on the right-hand side, a householder can log onto their home. And we've got a great tool for this we call our Plan Builder tool that will enable people to see their own property. It's based on EPC data. So for those of you who've got to be in the bonnet about EPCs, the data actually behind it isn't too bad, and it can be sense checked. Particularly if the householder is logging on and can modify their own data as they can here, it remodels their baseline, and then you can start buying stuff, in inverted commas, adding measures to your property, seeing the energy bills go down, the carbon go down, and your budget go up. You get the sort of level where you think, oh, right, that actually sounds quite interesting. My PV, so for instance, a package might be £100,000 less than you expected, or it might be £100,000 more. So you react in a certain way, you get in touch with the team, and we know quite a lot about you before we've had that conversation. Running a scheme like this is extraordinarily expensive if what you're doing all day is speaking to people who know nothing. You've got a whole bunch of people right now who could do this. And we've got this set up for the entirety of London and East and West Sussex right now, and Cambridgeshire. And then somebody comes to the house, actually then measures up properly and gets to the point where we start delivering the service. People really showing how do you get to net zero, which might involve planting some trees at the end, but people know what net zero means for them. And it's phased according to how they want to live in that building over a period of time. Okay, I hope I haven't gone too much over. There's some examples there, and do get in touch if you want to, but I'm obviously sticking around for a while and looking forward to your question.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Russell. I'm going to just immediately apologise if my internet drops out because I'm having all sorts of technical issues, but we have a wonderful team in the background who can step in if that happens. So if I suddenly freeze and go away, don't worry, others are keeping a watchful eye. So thank you to our three wonderful speakers. I mean, it's such a huge topic, and I think when we were putting together this event, we really struggled to find a way in to just start the conversation because we're trying really hard to grapple with it within ACAN. So thank you for that huge wealth of knowledge shared. We've got, the chat box has been quite active, so we've got some questions. If I can put the first one, and you maybe can decide between yourselves who to go for. But the first question is, this is a good one. What retrofit standards should we be promoting? And I think there's been a couple of questions akin to that in the box, such as, do you support the adoption of PAS 2035 and Trustmark? So I think rather than me compiling any more of those questions together, if we just maybe talk about that for a minute, what retrofit standards should we be promoting? Excuse me. Does anybody want to take that first?
I've got some views, but I'm happy to go.
Oh yeah, I think we've
Marianne is
got
the two of you are there. Oh, come on.
Well, I suppose I've been thinking about this a little bit, and I think there are two types of standard, and we need to be a bit clear about that. There's the performance standards, so where we get buildings to, and then there's also the process and kind of quality control standards, which is past 2035. Nowhere in it does it tell you what kind of carbon reduction you need to get to, or what. It's all about the process. And I think we probably need both of those. And I don't think at the moment there's a few things being developed. There's things have come on a lot, but I don't think there's a consensus about where we should be on that. I think there's been a bit of a move towards on the performance standards, and I think somebody else asked about whether space heating demand was better than EPCs, and I think the point I'd make is it depends what you're doing. If you're doing kind of large scale data analysis of whole housing stock, then that EPC data and looking at SAP ratings makes a lot of sense. There's a lot you can take from that. If you're making decisions, design decisions about an individual house or a block of houses, then you probably need something that's a bit more tangible as a designer, and that's when kind of space heat and demand or peak load and things like that start to come in. So I think we probably, there's a really great cartoon from XCKD, if many of you follow that, and there's, I'll drop it into the chat in a minute, but it's basically about, if you try to create kind of one standard and one ring to rule them all, you'll just end up with another standard that sits alongside all the others.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I'd agree with that completely. I guess I'd written down the what standards and the how standards, which is basically what Marianne said, right? And really the standard, let's talk about the what standard. There's only one standard to aim for, and that's net zero across the country, right? But really what will facilitate how we get that, what our minimum aim is for an individual dwelling that you come across, it will inevitably be a compromise between cost and performance, because we simply can't afford to do some of the stuff you need to for the older buildings in particular. It's a pain in the ass, right? And the building can't take it unless you really throw hundreds of thousands of pounds at it. So we need to accept that some of the buildings that are very hard to renovate, you know, let's get an air source heat pump in there, let's decarbonise the grid, it will do a lot of the work, but it still will mean if there's a fuel poor householder in it, they won't be able to afford to heat that house. That's the problem, right? So it doesn't matter whether it's a gas boiler or an air source heat pump, they won't be able to afford to heat their house, so they'll turn it off. It's a real problem. So where I come from, actually, we need to think about what data we've got, and Marianne hinted at this as well. When we just have EPC data for a dwelling, we can only go so far, because you get to a point where you're 80% guessing. Until someone goes to the property and measures stuff, you're getting very closer to the truth. But any model is not 100% truth, right? It's still guessing. So we need to be mature enough to say, we're effectively, over a period of time, we are commissioning a house. We're doing some things that we know are good, to the best of our knowledge at that moment in time, and we will get closer to that better performance of that property. So that means monitoring. That means installing stuff to tell us how that building works, right? It still perplexes me that there are heating systems that are actually very easy to monitor, being installed every day, and we don't really know how they perform. We just look at our energy bill and go, oh, blimey, that's a bit chunky. But really, if you could just monitor the temperature flows in the flow and return, you can know when it comes on and off. That can all be done with an app. They have to be really quite cheaply now. And so that should be a standard install. And the other thing, I saw one of the performance-based contracting was a comment in the chat earlier on. It's a natural migration onto that. If you could sell a retrofit to somebody in the same way that they buy or they get hold of a car with a PCP deal over a period of time, because they haven't got the cash to spend £250,000 on a retrofit, but their disposable income might allow them to pay for it over 25 years. As long as that deal with somebody is replacing some of the kit that loses its life in that period as well, that's an attractive offer, right? So this bit's about data and it's about monitoring, and that's at the core of where all this is going. So I'm quite relaxed about the standard, as long as somebody can afford it and it gets the house on a trajectory towards net zero at some point. So some people suggest Interlocking. Yeah. As long as they don't suggest passive house standard, because that's completely unaffordable, and I will stand by that. Shoot me down if you like. But Interlocking, yeah, why not? We're starting to learn a hell of a lot about that.
I think on that, Russell, as well, because it's you talked about the cost and the kind of benefit from the standard that you get to, as well as that we don't actually have the time or the resources or the social and economic capacity to move everyone out of all of their houses for 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. I know there are people who can claim they can do retrofits in a week, but I'm yet to see it actually happen. And it's that side of things as well, and what the whole kind of knock-on implications of disruption are. And the whole thing, I mean, what we find is that there's definitely, and that's why something like Retrofit exists, and the ACB have also just launched their retrofit standard, which is at that 50 kilowatt hours space heat and demand. That there's the is it the Pareto principle? Basically, you can get 80% of the way there for a certain amount of effort, but the last 20% will be 80% of the effort. So it's where do we need to get to? And that's why taking that whole, and Russell's absolutely right about data, it's about taking that whole systems view. So what do we need to do to get the entire country to that point? And it will be a different, to the point of being zero carbon, it will be different in each different house, and the calculations will be different.
Absolutely. If I could just make one small point about the how standard. PAS 2035 is something that I've been involved with. Well, we've been using retrofit coordinators at Retrofit Works for 10 years. So before the standard came along, because we believe there needs to be an impartial expert at the heart of the retrofit journey. Okay. Unfortunately, PAS 2035 is going down the route. I think 90% of the retrofit coordinators are employed by a contractor, right? So we're getting the opposite of that. It's not what we intended at all. But customers want impartial. Some don't, some do. So it's about the offer. Let's make lots of people lots of different offers. But about the how, PAS 2035 sitting alongside those competent person schemes, in other words, contractors that design and install something and say it's wonderful, they need a retrofit coordinator to make sure the household is actually taking a view that if the first person they speak to is a window installer, what's the window installer going to say? Ah, Mrs. Biggins, I think you should have new windows. So actually, the route to this is these building passports. It's a proper plan. It's thinking it through for the next 30 years. It's graduating along the things that you need in your property. There's only one way to do that, and there needs to be some kind of standard that dictates that. And the PAS 2035 standard talks about a journey and how it can happen. And actually, they've been very bold. They've taken Part F of the building regulations and actually said that's not quite good enough. This is what you should be doing with ventilation, right? But it's confused a few people as well. So it wasn't done in the right way, and it's been rushed through eco. Nobody can afford to install ventilation under eco either. But apart from all that, it's awesome. So I think Trustmark is the layer above that as well. And I think that's the thing that's really annoying people. But from my perspective, Retrofit Works is a Trustmark scheme. We believe in it, and it's all about consumer protection. All the things that if you look at, and it's not a long read, if you look at the framework that underpins Trustmark, it describes all the things that a customer wants to feel safe by, if that's the right phrase. And that's all it's trying to do. It's not trying to be anything other than trying to protect the consumer. How can you be annoyed by that? So I think if we just sort of look at what it is and decide what you want to do within it, and Trustmark are very mature with us. We say, well, this is how we want our scheme, and they just say, well, that meets all our standards. Brilliant. Well, you run your offer, you make your offer. And some customers like it, some don't. I mean, that's life, right? So we get loads of offers for lots of different people. And you know, one thing that we do, we work with, there's lots of architects on the call. Architects come to us with customers sometimes because they need sort of the engineering bit done for them. And I don't want to do the gloss. I want to make it work. So we can work in tandem with lots of architects all over the place. So it's about building up a scheme that we think is going to get people to get their houses done. That's the bottom.
I think it's true, isn't it, about having that. It's not ever going to be a one-size-fits-all solution for this. It's such a complex issue, which is why I suppose people haven't really been engaging with it, because it's not easy. It's not an easy thing to try and deliver on any level. But I think to take it away a little bit from there and bring it back to maybe sort of social housing side of it and local authority side of it. Dominic, this one I think is probably more geared towards you and your input, but how can we get local authorities to take action on domestic retrofit? And does it rely on their own ambitions?
It's a good question. I think our experience across the London local authorities, and I mentioned it earlier, is that we're taking slightly different pathways. So for some, there's much greater ambition, and for others, not so. You know, they just want to meet whatever the relevant guidance is. I think that it's probably not about housing retrofit. It's probably about where your local authority is just generally on their journey. So in London, I think it's 28 out of the 33 London local authorities have declared a climate emergency or have a climate action plan of some description. But again, they vary. So personally, I think it's one of those where it's kind of a classic no-brainer. We should be doing it. And, you know, and as Russell set out, I think there is something that can be done. but it's kind of against a political backdrop where it's one of 50 priorities. And unless it can fit in and slot in with other things that we need to do. So for example, in Enfield, we're looking at a holistic improvement scheme for a 22-storey residential block. But what we've done is we've had to pull in the retrofit on the back of fire safety works and cladding replacement, because otherwise we can't get it to stack up alone. And I think that is a really interesting point, is going back to the standards. Whatever you've got, it has to be affordable, because we're finding past 2035 is actually adding substantially to cost. And that's partly coming back to this, the industry is not ready, so you're paying a premium to get those kind of independent assessors, etc. Yeah, what can you do to get a local authority to do it? I think it's the same as for a householder. You've got to make a compelling case. There's got to be some benefit. And one of the big problems is it's heavy upfront capital with very long potential payback. And so it doesn't look particularly compelling. And I've tried to convince my finance team, and they don't see it as very compelling yet. So a little bit more work to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to finish, because actually both of these conversations have taken us back to making compelling cases. And I think one of the biggest things that we talk around in the existing buildings group is how to engage beyond the usual channels, and how to get the buy-in, and how do you make it aspirational, and how do you make this the thing that households want. And I think it isn't just about the...
Is that Sarah's internet gone?
Sounds like it.
Oh dear.
Energy savings, it's got frozen.
Oh,
No, my bad. Did I freeze?
You froze for a moment, yeah.
Thank you, Internet. It's probably telling me it's time to go into our breakout rooms. Thank you all so much for that. I think what we're going to do is our back of house team are going to pop us all into breakout rooms. We'll have maybe 10 or 15 minutes in those breakout rooms. There'll be a facilitator, it'll say it on the screen there, who can sort of help that conversation along. And it's just about brainstorming that, maybe that theme that your breakout room is. And then we would really encourage you to come and join us and take these things forward, because we're actually have quite a number of campaigns at the moment in ACAN, and we would love some new energy to come and join us and help us push those forward. And also at the end of this, about 8:45, we're going to have a virtual pub session, so that will be shared in the chat as well. So over to our brilliant team to throw us into those breakout rooms.